It was a result that few among the Western world wanted, but everyone knew was coming. On the 17th of March 2024, Russian President Vladimir Putin coasted to victory in an election that was far more a song and dance than it was a democratic exercise. Running as the only serious candidate allowed to participate in the election, standing alongside a token opposition party with outlawed campaigns, and in at least one case, the bodies of his political enemies laying at his feet, Putin's election to a fifth term as Russia's leader was all but preordained. As Russia continues its long march down roads of Putin's choosing, people around the world would be well within their rights to be asking questions. How did Putin assume such complete and total control of Russia's political system? Why do his people allow him to get away with it? And what does the future of Russia look like now that the 21st century Tsar has, for all intents and purposes, declared himself president for life? Election weekend. In Russia, presidential elections are a multi-day affair, one that in 2024 stretched across a long weekend from March the 15th to the 17th. Early voting for people living in remote regions of Russia began a couple of weeks prior on February the 26th. Across all Russian oblasts, basically provinces or states, plus 4 Ukrainian oblasts that Russia has illegally annexed during its years-long invasion of Ukraine, voters were presented with a ballot that included a total of 4 names. They were Nikolai Karanatov of Russia's Communist Party, Vladislav Davankov of the New People Party, and Leonid Slutsky of the Liberal Democratic Party, as well as independent candidate Vladimir Putin, who needs no introduction. In Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other Russian cities, once the heart of Russia's opposition movement, but now firmly part of electoral Putin territory, the voting took place without much trouble. The weekend was largely overcast in Moscow, dry and windless, but altogether comfortable to vote, with temperatures a few ticks above freezing. Voters arriving to polling stations were greeted with banners emblazoned with the letters V and Z, unofficial symbols that the Russian government has adopted to represent its ongoing offensive in Ukraine. Many people came in organized groups, particularly state employees, who some outside Russia claim are ordered to cast votes during election season or else face repercussions at work. Others came in ones and twos, saying hello to neighbors while they participated in a process that was, in most places, quite peaceful. In some parts of Russia, the elections weren't even the most important thing going on, amidst celebrations of a pagan holiday that's supposed to herald the end of the winter season. As Russia cast its votes, it struck a defiant posture toward the global West, reiterating via press spokespeople that Russia's democratic process is not to be challenged or mocked by other nations. In a reiteration of a common line for the Kremlin, Russia attempted to minimize the rather sham-like qualities of its voting process, citing the myriad shortcomings and failings of these other nations, usually failings that have little to do with Russia's situation, in order to insist that Russia shouldn't be lectured about what it does on its own territory. Efforts to point out that Russia's elections were neither free nor fair were met with the usual Kremlin whataboutism and the usual claims that Putin enjoys strong support in Russia. That, by the way, is a claim that couldn't be verified even if it were true, owing to Russia's refusal to allow foreign, non-government or media organizations to do their work inside Russian borders. International observers were similarly barred from taking part, said Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov about the decision, quoting, "We will no longer tolerate criticism of our democracy and claims that it is not the kind that it should be. Our democracy is the best, and we will continue to build it." Efforts to condemn Russia's extension of its voting process to 4 occupied Ukrainian oblasts were met with a dismissive wave of the hand and sentiments roughly equating to, just you wait and see how much those new Russian oblasts love Putin. They're gonna love him. Across Russia, acts of resistance weren't common exactly, but they weren't absent either. In a large-scale protest on Sunday the 17th, many prospective voters chose to show up in a protest called Noon Against Putin, standing at or outside the protest but not casting ballots in order to show solidarity with other people who are against the Russian regime. That was one of the last acts of resistance suggested by Russian opposition leader and activist Alexei Navalny prior to his recent death in a Russian penal colony, and it's been promoted by both his widow and the broader international anti-Putin movement across the Russian diaspora. Navalny's face, his name, and his slogans were also present on t-shirts and stickers on occasion all across the country. But without any purpose other than a show of solidarity, Noon Against Putin came and went without incident. Other protests by the families of Russian conscripts hoping to advocate for their return were broken up and harassed by police. Outside the organized protests, individual citizens also took matters into their own hands. In several incidents across Russia, people poured liquid dyes into ballot boxes or tried to set fires at polling stations, including one woman from St. Petersburg who threw a Molotov cocktail at a school where 2 polling stations were operating inside. Others spoiled their ballots and posted photos on social media. The United Russia Political Party, the country's dominant political organization, even suffered a cyber attack during the busiest days of voting. But even still, for a nation spanning 11 time zones called home by over 143 million people, these incidents were relatively rare. By and large, the weekends featured a relatively docile voting public, one in which even opposition movements didn't attempt to engage in any action that might have brought even a sliver of hope that the outcome might be changed. Vladimir Putin's 5th presidential term was all but preordained, and the people of Russia knew it. In occupied parts of Ukraine, the voting process was rather less straightforward. In some parts of the 4 oblasts that Russia has illegally annexed, plus the Isthmus of Crimea annexed in 2014, support for Russia is strong. Just for example, the separatist insurgencies that raged for years in Donetsk and Luhansk provinces in Ukraine's Donbass region are widely understood to have started courtesy of the pro-Russian local population before they ever got support from Russia. In Donetsk and Luhansk, now rather firmly under Russian control, voters who were enthusiastic about casting their vote for Putin did it in cities and towns replete with signs that Russia had consolidated its authority, billboards, posters, and plenty of armed guards to ensure election security. They were joined, according to some anti-Russian sources, by Russians bussed in from elsewhere to inflate voter turnout. But other residents of the annexed oblasts have told a different version of events. According to videos and other accounts posted to international social media, local poll workers going door to door in those oblasts have done it accompanied by masked gunmen. In these areas, voters aren't required to go to the ballot box. Instead, they can cast their ballots from their own doorsteps, during which time, pro-Russian leadership fully admits, residents can expect to be filmed with armed masked troops present. All of that happens under the umbrella of a campaign called Inform IUK, ostensibly meant to educate voters about the process by visiting every resident of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts in their homes. In practice, the Putin regime hoped for a demonstration of strong voter turnout in these places, where, of course, people casting their vote at gunpoint will be able to choose between the obvious choice they're supposed to pick, Putin, and 3 alternatives they've likely never heard of. As Ukraine's governor of the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia region put it, our citizens are very afraid. Of course, if Russians with soldiers come to their flat and ask if they'd like to vote for Putin, everyone will say, okay, yes, because everyone wants to save their life. But it does not mean that our citizens want to support Putin. For Moscow, that doesn't matter much. Strong turnout and thus a strong vote for Putin is a way to make Russia's territorial claims appear more legitimate, so that Putin and other Kremlin representatives can dismiss all the asterisks around them with little more than a wave of the hand. There was, however, one more wrinkle to Russia's electoral process this year, specifically attacks and sabotage by Ukraine, other armed groups, and ordinary civilians. On the day that early voting began in the occupied region of Kherson, bombs exploded in the city of Nova Kakhovka, targeting the local headquarters of Russia's dominant political party, as well as a polling station. Days later, Ukraine's main intelligence directorate would report the killing of a local woman in the Zaporizhzhia region who had been helping out with Russia's electoral process. When asked whether the people who'd killed the woman were associated with the Ukrainian government, Ukraine's governor of the region confirmed it, quoting, "Yes, of course, there is great cooperation between our resistance inside the temporarily occupied territories and our secret services." On the 15th of March, an improvised explosive device went off inside a polling station in Kherson Oblast, injuring 5 soldiers. The following day, Kherson's Russian governor claimed that a Ukrainian drone strike had injured 4 more people and killed 1 in an attempt to interrupt the vote. Even more significant, though, was a limited incursion into Western Russia by multiple anti-Putin armed groups. These are Ukraine-backed groups opposing the Russian government, but they're made up of Russian fighters. Starting on March the 12th, these groups, including the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Sibir Battalion, and maybe more, they've taken over multiple settlements inside Western Russia's Kursk Oblast. At the time of writing, they claim to still hold that territory. The incursion is meant to be a direct protest to Russia's election, especially the imposition of elections on occupied Ukrainian territory. With the backdrop of that incursion, Ukraine has launched several dozen drone attacks across the parts of Russia that are within its range, scoring a few hits in the process against infrastructure and supply targets. Meanwhile, Ukrainian shelling of the border city of Belgorod is believed to have backfired. First meant as an attempt to impose costs of the Ukraine invasion on Russian citizens during the vote, it's believed to have instead spiked turnout in Belgorod as citizens there retaliated with their ballots. In the end, neither protest nor act of war would be enough to stand in the way of the result. When the vote count was released on March the 18th, Vladimir Putin won with 88.48% of the total vote, including 76,277,708 individual votes, alongside a turnout rate of 77.4%. As is generally the case when Putin runs for re-election, the runner-up was the communist candidate, Nikolai Kharitonov, who came away with 4.37% of the votes. Peace-ish candidate Vladislav Davankov received 3.9%, and extreme candidate Leonid Slutsky received 3.24%. It was the biggest margin of victory by far of Putin's entire political career, along with higher turnout than in Russia's last presidential election. Even with so many caveats about the illegitimacy of the vote, it's still telling that in a system where Russia can essentially write whatever final number it wishes on the vote tally, it chose to avoid what Russia had done in past years, showing non-negligible opposition support to keep up appearances of fairness. This time, they didn't even bother to create that illusion. A cruel campaign season. To truly understand Putin's victory in context, we've got to understand just how complete his control over Russia's electoral process has been for decades. Putin's election to his third term in 2012 and his fourth in 2018 were elections where the outcome basically wasn't in doubt, and well, neither was this one. The reason for that is the Kremlin's recent history of relying on token opposition candidates. That is to say, they won't present an election to the Russian people where Putin is the only candidate, or at least they haven't yet, but they will make sure that Putin's rival candidates don't have any chance of beating him. If a candidate can be trusted to avoid criticizing Putin, avoid having any policy position different from Putin's, and avoid actively campaigning in a way that might jeopardize Putin's supremacy, they're welcome to run, which they might do in order to raise their own name recognition or score some political points inside the Kremlin. Typically, this plays out the same way. The communist candidate comes in a very distant second, largely capturing the support of older voters who remember the Soviet Union fondly, while everyone else pulls support in the low single digits. In this particular election, the communist candidate was one Nikolai Kharitonov. He'd run against Putin once before in 2004 and secured 13% of the vote. This time, though, he won just over 4.3%. He's repeatedly refused to levy any criticism Putin's way, stating to Russian media at one point about Putin, "He is responsible for his own cycle of work. Why would I criticize him?" Also in the race was Leonid Slutsky, a longtime member of the Russian State Duma or lower parliament. He's an ultra-nationalist candidate, soaking up some of the far-right vote inside Russia, and while he's an interesting and controversial figure in his own right, he didn't offer much meaningful contrast to Putin other than pure ideological extremism. And finally, there was 40-year-old Vladislav Davankov, deputy chairman of the Duma, a longtime Putin ally, who's held off from any criticism against anybody else involved in the race. Of the three non-Putin candidates, Davankov's gotten the most attention because of his endorsement of negotiations and an eventual peace deal with Ukraine. But even calling Davankov a peace candidate at all somewhat oversells his position. While he does support negotiations with Ukraine, he stipulated that Russia's capture of the territory it currently occupies would be non-negotiable. That makes his position basically indistinguishable from what Putin's own Kremlin has stated that it would require as a bare minimum if negotiations were to take place. And that's not an accident either. Again, this is a token opposition, and although the candidates Putin allows to oppose him do offer a different face, they don't offer any meaningful policy alternatives other than the Communist Party, whose platform has long since fallen out of favor with most Russians. Thus, Putin gets the benefits that come from the appearance of allowing political opposition, and yet his slate of candidates aren't even worth the real Russian opposition's time in supporting. What they really offer, Davankov especially, is a somewhat reworded version of Putin's own position. In reality, there had been a true anti-war candidate in Russia's elections, at least for a little while. He was a long-time opposition politician called Boris Nadezhin, a man who'd once had close ties to prominent opposition politician Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated near the Kremlin in 2015 after trying to rally Russia's support of the then low-grade insurgency in Ukraine. Nadezhin had offered his 2024 candidacy on a platform that included ending the war in Ukraine, but also included rallying against Putin directly. Said Nadezhin in his own words, referring to Putin, "Practically he destroyed the key institutions of modern government, of modern state in Russia, like parliament, like courts, like free elections, etc. My job will be to restore these institutions." Nadezhin brought hundreds of thousands of signatures to a petition to support his political candidacy, but he was barred from that in early February, with Russia citing minor typos in some of his petition signatures as a reason to bar him from candidacy completely. Said one Russian propagandist on state TV just ahead of his disqualification, I feel bad for Boris. The fool didn't realize that he's not being set up to run for president, but for a criminal case on charges of betraying the motherland. In reality, the outcome that he'd be disqualified from candidacy seemed to be all but a foregone conclusion among most international observers, a sentiment that even Nadezhd himself agreed with. At the time of writing, he is still alive, which is more than can be said for many people who've tried to launch real opposition to Putin. How long he remains alive? Well, we'll just have to see. While Nadezhd has long had a reputation of being careful with what he says and when he says it, his actions during the campaign reflected a much greater willingness to cross Putin outright. He, like anyone else, knows that Putin will encourage token opposition or even allow real opposition candidates to run for something if he believes they don't have much chance of victory. Take, for example, Alexei Navalny's 2013 campaign to be mayor of Moscow, where he ran against a popular incumbent mayor who was a close Putin ally and was predictably trounced in the polls. Occasions like that are acceptable to Putin, since they allow him to keep up appearances while accepting basically no real risk. What Nadezhd did in these 2024 elections was to give a real outlet for Russian frustration on an issue that has become a very, very sore subject for the Kremlin. If Russia's past conduct predicts its future conduct, then that doesn't portend well for his future as a breathing man. Nor was Nadezhd the only opposition candidate to find himself removed from the ballot. One Ekaterina Duntsova, a former television journalist, ran as a fringe candidate while calling for the release of political prisoners and demanding an end to the war in Ukraine. Duntsova's campaign was regarded by international observers to have been one of two things: either a combination of bravery and foolhardiness, or outright scripted by the Kremlin. She was booted from the election all the way back in December and was unable to get any Russian political party to pick up her cause. She was then detained in January and has since stayed pretty quiet, with her personal and political future entirely unclear. And finally, there's one more name to consider. Not one who stood any hope of running in the 2024 elections, but who was nonetheless seen as the last individual bastion of Russian opposition until very recently: Alexei Navalny. Now, we've published a prior episode where we talk at length about who Navalny was, what he did, and why he was such a potent threat to Vladimir Putin, so check that out if you'd like to learn more. But for now, suffice it to say that Navalny was the only face and name who's really represented Russia's opposition movement over the last decade or so. For the past several years, he did that as a political prisoner behind bars in Moscow after he returned to Russia to face incarceration, even despite having just survived an attempt on his life. But on February the 16th of this year, Navalny died under highly suspicious circumstances in a Russian penal colony. Whether he died of at least nominally natural causes or was killed, the world may never know. But regardless, Navalny has now gone down with the rest of the opposition movement inside Russia, with no clear successor to take his place. It may be an alien concept to our viewers here on Warographics, most of whom live under free and fair electoral systems in the global West, that in the midst of such a clearly rigged process, the people of Russia still continue to tolerate Vladimir Putin anyway. And on the other side, it's just as tempting to view that logic from its opposite angle. If the people of Russia don't care about any of this, then why should we? As for why Putin is tolerated, well, even though it's all but impossible to get an accurate assessment of his popularity, it's widely known that he still maintains at least relative popularity in his own country. That sentiment was on full display, even from voters in this last election. Said one Russian great-grandmother speaking to NBC News in Moscow, 90-year-old Nina Kiseleva, quote, "I remember when Stalin died, his funeral in 1953. I remember it well. And now I trust only Putin." Said other proud voters, also to NBC, quote, "We live well, we are satisfied with everything, and well, we are satisfied with our president." And quote, "He is the only person who has made others respect Russia as a country recently." Putin's personal approval ratings are high. The Kremlin's propaganda around the war in Ukraine has been successful in rallying support for the war effort, and unfortunately, the same Western powers that Putin disdains sometimes make it all too easy for Russian leaders to point out hypocrisy and foolishness in European and American leadership. Putin's insistence on dogged whataboutism when Westerners critique his country does absolutely get tiresome, but for many voters, that sort of logic does hit home. Of course, we must point out the tight restrictions on foreign media operating inside Russia and emphasize that Western media has essentially no ability to interact with voters in private conversations or in polling stations other than the ones Russia carefully selects. But nonetheless, the idea that Putin is roundly hated or rejected by the people of Russia with anything even close to unanimity is simply false. Regardless of anything else about his time in office, the average Russian citizen has seen their lot in life improve dramatically across the 25 years that Putin has been in power, even accounting for recent economic downturns. Not to mention, between Boris Yeltsin in the 90s and a long line of Soviet premiers, the bar for Russian leadership has been on the floor for quite a while, and the cold competency of Putin's rule, even despite its nearly endless caveats, still is seen by many people inside Russia as a relatively decent outcome. And now with Putin coasting to victory, it's the result they've got, for better or worse. President Putin's fifth term. Putin's election to a fifth term of office represents 25 consecutive years in which one man has held ultimate authority inside Russia. Although he took a step back from the presidency from 2008 to 2012, allowing his ally Dmitry Medvedev to serve as a figurehead while Putin stepped into the role of prime minister, it is no secret who was really pulling the strings in those years. Now, the law that had prevented Putin from serving more than 2 terms consecutively, thus necessitating 4 years of Medvedev in the first place, has been put aside permanently. It joins the law that previously established Russian presidential terms as 4 years, now lengthened to 6, and the chronological trackers that would have kept track of Putin's number of presidential terms, which were reset to 0 in 2020. But more important than just getting rid of specific laws has been Putin's effort to get rid of judicial oversight, or for that matter, any mechanism that would enable a person other than Vladimir Putin to establish legal realities inside Russia. Russia's courts and its legislature have no will at this point to risk crossing Putin. But they've also got no means to do so, even if they wanted to. In his victory speech, Putin called for a further strengthening of the Russian military and vowed that he would do everything in his power to solve Russia's remaining obstacles in its invasion of Ukraine, which of course he still refers to as, quote, a special military operation. He derided the so-called Noon Against Putin process as ineffectual and called for the punishment of people who'd carried out vandalism during the voting process. He expressed sadness over the death of Alexei Navalny and claimed that prior to Navalny's passing, he had agreed to a prisoner swap that would have Navalny sent back to the West as a free man, with the stipulation that he could not return to Russia. He praised Russia's strengthening relationship with China and decried what he called a lack of democracy in Europe and the United States, claiming that Russia's electoral systems are more transparent than those of the Western world. Finally, he threatened the nuclear apocalypse, claiming that any Western troops present in Ukraine would put the whole world on the brink of a third world war. In the wake of Putin's re-election, it's highly unlikely that there will be any great change in Russia's political direction. Putin's position on the war in Ukraine isn't about to reverse, and if anything, he may celebrate his victory with a start to what looks like it'll be a Russian summer offensive. Domestically, there's nothing that Putin couldn't have done before the election that he would suddenly have gained the ability to do now. But what will probably happen, as it tends to every time Putin coasts to re-election, is yet another incremental tightening of Russia's authority structure in order to concentrate power even more into Putin's hands. Usually this will mean annulling a few inconvenient laws, passing a couple of new pieces of legislation, perhaps offing a political opponent or two, that sort of thing. Any specifics, we'll just have to wait for Putin to reveal when he feels ready. Russian sources suggest that Putin may also reshuffle many of the government positions, incorporating younger leaders into the future of Russian governance while shifting older officials aside into more ceremonial positions. Those changes may ripple through not just the Kremlin, but Russia's state-owned companies and its regional governments. He'll probably do one other thing too, overtake Joseph Stalin as Russia's longest-serving leader in over 200 years. Stalin, for his part, ruled for 29 years, leaving Putin just 5 to go. While Putin, age 71, has been the subject of ongoing speculation about his failing health for years now, he currently appears, if not exactly vibrant, then certainly not in his final days. Although there's limited evidence to suggest that he may deal with Parkinson's disease, a motor neuron issue, or even cancer, there's zero hard proof of any of these claims, at least none known to Western media. With rumors of an impending palace coup inside the Kremlin being put to bed, at least for now, Putin, on his current course, will overtake Stalin's record well before the end of his 5th term, and if he gets that far, then it's probably safe to assume that his 5th term's not going to be his last. On the global scale, it appears that Putin's Russia is primed to continue strengthening economic ties with China, Iran, and other non-Western international partners, and making overtures to smaller states and non-state actors who find themselves maligned by the international community. His focus on NATO expansion, particularly in and through Ukraine, is stronger than ever, and many international analysts now speculate that Putin may hope to engage in an act of aggression against NATO and thus test the waters on just how unified the alliance really is before the end of the decade. And in Ukraine, it seems as if the next few months, at a minimum, will proceed in Russia's favor. Although the slow, creeping Russian advance has myriad issues and may not be sustained forever, it's still more than enough to keep taking territory from a Ukrainian defense that is increasingly exhausted and that lacks the support of Western backers. After the bumbling inefficiencies of the early months of the Ukraine war, Putin is on track to at least somewhat reduce the military corruption of his own nation and may greatly increase his country's capacity for military production in the coming years. So, as Vladimir Putin consolidates his grip even further on modern Russia, so too does he consolidate Russia's position for the 6 years to come. Barring illness, injury, or other personal catastrophe for Putin, his fifth term will likely see Russia work toward actually becoming the military powerhouse it spent decades bluffing that it actually was. It'll see Russia continue to separate its economy from the West, continue to engage in diplomatic antagonism, and work to create a sphere of influence where Russia can basically do as it sees fit. Putin will be 77 at the end of his current term, and if he's in good health by that time, it's entirely likely that he'll cruise to victory for a sixth. By then, at the end of 2036, who knows where Russia, the West, or Vladimir Putin himself will be. But we're dealing with a man who, whether he admits it or not, would clearly like to be Russia's president for life. Now, there's nobody left to stand in his way. Not an opposition, not a judiciary, not a legislature, and not the Russian people either. We hope that in the months and years to come, something may shift inside Russia for the better. But as of now, that seems entirely unlikely to happen.